Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
When we think about power or influence or just getting your message out to the masses, we usually imagine this like a giant, heavy oak door.
Oh, absolutely. With a velvet rope and everything.
Right, a velvet rope, a big brass lock, and this really intimidating bouncer just standing there holding a clipboard. And for decades, that was the literal reality of mass communication.
Yeah, it was.
You either had the right look, the right connections, or, the right pedigree to get past that bouncer, or you were just left standing out in the cold.
Well, because the entire system of public influence was built on that physical and institutional gatekeeping. It was incredibly rigid.
Because there just wasn't enough space. Right?
Exactly. The bandwidth was so limited. You only had a few television networks, maybe a few major newspapers, and a handful of political parties who actually decided who was allowed to hold the microphone.
But then, almost overnight, it feels like that heavy oak door just vanished.
Well, it's gone.
Yeah. Suddenly, there's no bouncer. Anyone can walk right into the club, grab a mic, and start broadcasting to the entire room. And, on the surface, that feels incredibly liberating.
Feels like the democratization of the voice, right?
Exactly. But, and this is the terrifying twist we are unpacking for you in today's deep dive, the door didn't actually disappear. The walls didn't come down. They just became invisible.
And now they're being built directly inside our own minds.
Which is wild. So today's mission is decoding the mechanics of influence, persuasion, and messaging in this modern era. We're looking at three distinct but totally interconnected sources.
It's a fascinating stack of research.
It really is. We've got a TEDx talk by Victoria Bonney on how social media broke the traditional political mold, another TEDx talk by Keisha Brewer breaking down the exact 4 steps of strategic communication, and then this pretty chilling excerpt from a text called The Algorithmic Siege about micro-targeted psychological warfare.
So we are essentially going to explore how communication has evolved from the hands of those elite TV gatekeepers to the raw, authentic power of the individual and all the way to the automated weaponization of our own personal data. It is the absolute definition of a paradigm shift.
Totally. So to understand how these invisible walls are being built today, we have to look at what happened when the physical walls fell. And Victoria Bonney gives us this perfect lens for it. She's a political communications expert who actually lived through this transition.
Right. She describes that old era of gatekeepers as the Mount Rushmore mold.
Yes, the Mount Rushmore mold, meaning if you wanted to run for office or have any kind of major platform, you essentially had to look like the guys carved into the mountain.
You needed to be male, have an Ivy League degree, a massive war chest of old money, and, preferably a famous last name.
And even if you had all that, the mechanics of reaching voters were completely locked down. Like, you couldn't just tweet a video directly to millions of people.
No, you had to get booked on Sunday morning shows like Meet the Press or primetime slots on 60 Minutes.
And getting past that bouncer was notoriously impossible unless you already had deep connections in that elite media circle. Bonney actually shares this super vivid memory from her childhood that captures how bizarre this era was.
Oh, the New Hampshire story.
Yes. So she grew up in New Hampshire, which, because of the early presidential primary, gave her this weird front row seat to national politics. She remembers Bill Clinton's motorcade literally driving past her family's yard sale.
This is such a funny image.
Right. She saw Bob Dole just hanging out in her school cafeteria and Bill Bradley shooting hoops in the local gym.
Yeah.
But she said that despite seeing these powerful figures up close, the interactions felt completely scripted.
Hollow, almost.
Yeah, hollow and unrelatable, like they were actors reciting lines for a camera that wasn't even there.
But, the scripted nature of those interactions wasn't necessarily a personal failing of those specific politicians.
What do you mean?
Well, it was a structural requirement of the medium itself. Think about it. When your only access to the public is filtered through a heavily edited, 3-minute segment on the evening news, you cannot afford nuance.
Oh, I saw.
You cannot afford to think out loud or show vulnerability. You have to stick to the focus group script because a single misstep would be the only thing the gatekeepers broadcasted. The medium literally forced them to become polished statues.
That makes total sense. The medium is the message. But that statue really started to crack in 2004.
With the Howard Dean campaign.
Exactly. Bonney pinpoints this as the major turning point. She was a 19-year-old college student when America declared war with Iraq. And she was watching Meet the Press, one of those ultimate gatekeeper shows, and saw Howard Dean, the governor of Vermont, forcefully speaking out against the war.
He was flat out stating that Iraq hadn't attacked the U.S. on 9/11 and that her generation would pay the price.
Right, and he was raw, he was unpolished, and he was visibly angry. He bypassed that traditional emotional script. And more importantly, he revolutionized the financial mechanics of politics.
Oh, the internet donations.
Exactly. Before Dean, funding a national campaign meant flying around the country hosting $1,000-a-plate dinners for wealthy donors, which is just another massive gatekeeper.
Right.
But Dean utilized early internet forums to bundle $10 and $20 donations from thousands of regular people. He essentially used the early web to bypass the financial bouncer.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, though, because there's a really tragic irony to the Howard Dean campaign.
A media bouncer.
Yes, he bypassed the financial bouncer, but he couldn't bypass the media bouncer. He had the internet money, he had the grassroots energy, but social media as a broadcast tool didn't exist yet. Like Facebook was still years away from being public.
Right, so he didn't own the distribution.
Exactly. So when he had his infamous Dean scream moment after the Iowa caucus, where he gave this fired up, slightly off-script speech and let out that weird yee-haw yell, the traditional media still had total control over the narrative, and they played it on an endless loop.
Endless loop. They labeled him unhinged. To go back to our opening metaphor, he didn't fit the dress code, so the bouncers literally threw him out of the club for being too enthusiastic.
It's crazy to think about. But fast forward 14 years, and that traditional media bouncer has lost entirely. The smartphone handed a global broadcasting tower to every single citizen.
And it completely shattered the old rules of decorum. It's wild to look at the contrast.
It really is. Now, before we delve into the specific modern examples Bonnie highlights, I do want to pause and address you, the listener, directly for a second.
Good idea.
We are about to look at some specific, highly recognizable political figures from recent history. We are examining these examples strictly through the lens of communication mechanics and strategy, just to understand how the landscape has structurally shifted.
Right.
We are not endorsing or taking sides on any political viewpoints, left or right. Our goal is purely to break down the machinery of the modern message.
Absolutely, because when you look under the hood of that machinery, the shift is staggering. Like, Bonnie points out that our current 72-year-old president managed to get essentially every member of Congress actively reacting to his Twitter feed.
The whole dynamic shifted.
The baseline of political rhetoric shifted so dramatically that the Dean scream, which ended a presidential run in 2004, would barely register as a blip today. I mean, crowds chanting "lock her up" at rallies is just a regular Tuesday now. The polished, pull-tested talking points just don't break through the noise anymore.
Because if a message feels manufactured today, the audience's internal spam filter just instantly blocks it.
Yep.
Authenticity, even if it manifests as messiness or anger, has become the dominant currency. And it's not just about the tone either, it's about the speed of action. The feedback loop between the public and the powerful has been compressed from months to minutes.
And Bonnie has a great story that illustrates this compression from her time working as a communications director for a congresswoman.
The hashtag.
Yeah, the hashtag where are the children. It started going viral regarding immigrant children being separated from their families at the U.S. border. Previously, under the old rules, a politician might wait for a quarterly poll to see if this was a real issue before acting.
But instead, their office was immediately flooded with real-time demands. The smartphone allowed the public to instantly coordinate their outrage and point it directly at their representatives.
So Bonnie and her boss literally flew down to Brownsville, Texas. They bypassed the news networks entirely, pulled out their own phones, and documented the detention centers themselves using videos and tweets.
They became the direct eyes and ears for their constituents.
Exactly. And that raw, unedited documentation turned constituent outrage into legislative backing within days. The gap between the voters' concern and the politicians' action was closed completely by a phone camera.
And this direct line to the audience fundamentally altered the mechanics of political defense, too. It essentially killed traditional opposition research.
Oh, this part is fascinating.
Right. In the Mount Rushmore era, campaigns spent millions digging into a candidate's past to find a flaw or a mistake or an inconsistency. Because the candidate had to project absolute perfection, any flaw was fatal.
But now, vulnerability itself is the armor. Bonnie talks about how, like 12 years ago when she ran for state rep, She desperately tried to hide the fact that she was working 2 waitressing jobs and had massive student loan debt. She thought it made her look unqualified.
But look at how Stacey Abrams handled attacks about her personal debt.
Right. She didn't hide it. She totally leaned into it. She told voters, yes, I have debt just like millions of you because I needed a loan for my education.
And by owning the flaw, she completely neutralized the attack. It's like psychological jujitsu. You cannot be exposed for a secret. You're already shouting from the rooftops.
Beto O'Rourke did something similar, right? Just documenting the most mundane, unpolished moments of his life on the campaign trail.
Yeah, eating fast food, doing his laundry. That hyper-transparency helped him raise an unprecedented $40 million in just 3 months.
So we have this massive shift. The bouncers are gone. We all have the microphone. Raw authenticity and vulnerability are the new baseline requirements just to get people's attention. But, and this is but let's take a step back.
Yeah.
Just because you have a direct line to your audience and just because you are being authentically yourself doesn't mean anyone is actually going to listen to you or give you what you want. Like, screaming your authentic truth into a microphone is often just making noise.
That is the critical pivot point.
Yeah.
Having the floor is not the same as having influence. To translate that attention into actual persuasion, you need a distinct architecture behind your message.
And this naturally brings us to our second source, the framework developed by Keisha Brewer. She's a strategic communications expert.
Right. And Brewer starts by dismantling a piece of advice that is so common, it's practically a cliché.
Oh, I know this one. It's not what you say, it's how you say it. We've all heard that a million times.
We have. But Brewer argues it is fundamentally flawed. Her core thesis is that the actual substance, what you say, is equally as critical as the delivery.
To put that into practice, she developed this 4-step framework for strategic communication. But before we break down those mechanics, we probably need to address the ethical elephant in the room regarding strategic wording.
Let's do it.
Because when we start talking about strategically structuring our words to get exactly what we want from other people, wait, isn't that just a polite corporate euphemism for manipulation?
That's a fair question, but Brewer draws a very sharp psychological distinction here.
Okay, what is it?
Manipulation is an inherently parasitic dynamic. It's about extracting what you want from someone, often by obscuring your true intentions and leaving them at a deficit. Strategic communication, by her definition, is symbiotic.
Symbiotic, meaning both sides win.
Exactly. It requires communicating with clear purpose while actively showcasing value to create a mutually beneficial outcome. Both parties have to walk away feeling like their needs were met.
Okay, so it's not a zero-sum game. I like that. So how does she actually construct this? She uses 4 steps. Identify the goal, understand your audience, communicate the value, and express the need.
And to show how this works in the wild, she tells this great story about her very first day as a communication specialist. Her boss gives her a massive test right out of the gate.
Yeah.
Land a partnership with Google for an upcoming event.
No pressure on day one, right? And I think most people in that situation would just panic and draft a generic pleading email heavily focused on their own desire for the partnership. They would jump straight to expressing the need.
But she ran the framework. Step 1, the goal is clear. Land the partnership. Step 2 is where the magic happens.
Yeah.
Understand the audience. She didn't just assume she knew what Google wanted.
She did her homework.
She aggressively researched their current corporate initiatives, their mission statement, and the specific profiles of the partnerships they were currently funding.
Which is crucial because it shifts the focus from the speaker to the listener.
Right.
And by deeply understanding Google's immediate priorities, she was able to move to step 3, communicate the value. She didn't pitch her event. She pitched a solution to Google's problem. She aligned her company's mission directly with Google's stated goals, creating this sort of psychological in-group dynamic. She positioned them as allies working toward the exact same outcome.
And only then, after establishing that mutual alignment, did she move to step 4 and express the need, the actual specific details of the partnership.
And it worked. Google replied in less than 12 hours, agreeing to the deal. She essentially applied an engineering schematic to human interaction.
She did. And what proves the universal nature of this framework is that it isn't limited to corporate boardrooms. Brewer demonstrates how these exact same psychological gears apply to our personal lives, too.
Oh, I love this part, the matchmaker story.
Yes. She uses this rather amusing anecdote about her friend Jessica.
Right, so Jessica gets an Instagram like from an ex-fling, and she immediately decides, I want him to be my boyfriend. So she enlists Keisha, her communication specialist friend, to help her seal the deal.
And they apply the exact same 4 steps.
It's brilliant. Step 1, goal. Get the boyfriend. Step 2, understand the audience. Jessica didn't just DM him, hey, she treated his Instagram feed like opposition research, but for romance.
Exactly. She identified his core, stated values, like he loves a specific type of indie music, he's a massive foodie, and he is very close to his mother.
Which allowed her to execute step 3 effortlessly. She initiated conversations that naturally highlighted her own identical interests. She was communicating value by demonstrating that they already belonged to the same tribe.
And doing that bypasses the natural defensiveness we feel when we think we're being sold to, whether it's a corporate pitch or a romantic proposition.
And it sets up step 4 perfectly. By the time they grab a drink and she expresses the need that they should date, it feels like it's his idea too. 6 months later, they were official. It's just a brilliant human-centric tool for finding common ground. Keisha even used those exact same steps in real time during her TEDx talk with the audience.
It really is an elegant framework. And this is where things get dark. Let's take that framework. Goal, audience, value, need, and scale it up.
Okay.
These mechanics are highly effective when human beings use them to find authentic mutual alignment. But what happens when the entity executing the understand your audience step isn't a human scrolling through an Instagram feed, but a supercomputer processing billions of behavioral data points per second?
Oh, man.
And what happens when the goal is no longer a mutually beneficial partnership, but the actual psychological domination of a society?
And this is where we cross the threshold into our final piece of research, that excerpt from the text called The Algorithmic Siege. And honestly, this completely reframes everything we've talked about so far today.
It really does.
We are no longer talking about a scrappy candidate using an iPhone or a clever employee drafting an email to Google. We are looking at state actors and sophisticated entities infiltrating what the text calls the invisible architecture of cognitive domain operations.
Yeah, cognitive domain operations is actually military terminology. It refers to warfare conducted directly against the human mind. The text details how algorithmic precision is weaponizing our own personal data to bypass our traditional rational defense mechanisms.
I was trying to wrap my head around this concept earlier, and the best way I can describe it is this. If Keisha Brewer's 4-step framework is like a master tailor hand-stitching a custom suit for you based on a few measurements,
Okay.
then this algorithmic siege is more like a casino architect. The architect doesn't physically force you to sit at the slot machine and pull the lever, but they control the oxygen levels, they control the absence of clocks, they engineer the carpets to keep you awake, and they tune the chimes of the machines to perfectly trigger your dopamine. They control the invisible environment so thoroughly that pulling the lever feels like your own original rational idea.
That is an incredibly accurate analogy because it highlights the illusion of choice. We all like to think of ourselves as rational actors. We believe that if we see a piece of propaganda or a bad argument online, our prefrontal cortex will engage, analyze it, and dismiss it.
But the siege doesn't target the prefrontal cortex, does it?
Exactly the opposite. The text explains that these bad actors are exploiting neuro-linguistic vulnerabilities. This means they aren't trying to win a debate with facts. They are hacking the biological way your brain processes language and emotion.
Wait, walk us through the actual mechanism of this. What does a neuro-linguistic attack actually look like on my phone?
Okay, let's say the algorithm's profile on you, which is built from every lingering scroll, every click, maybe even every heart rate fluctuation tracked by your smartwatch, knows that you have deep underlying anxiety about financial security.
Okay, pretty common.
Right. The algorithm identifies its goal: to make you feel outraged and distrustful of a specific institution. It doesn't just show you a generic hit piece. It specifically alters the phrasing of a headline in your feed to use highly specific trigger words associated with scarcity, theft, or loss.
So it's dynamically tailoring the vocabulary to my personal psychological profile.
Precisely. And when you read those specific words, they act as a linguistic trigger that stimulates a localized response in your amygdala, the fear center of your brain.
Oh, wow.
Your amygdala floods your system with stress hormones before your logical, rational brain even finishes processing the grammar of the sentence. By the time you consciously read the article, you are already biologically primed to feel threatened and angry. Your critical thinking has been chemically bypassed.
It is the ultimate dark mirror version of Brewer's strategic communication. The algorithm identifies the goal, radicalization or compliance. It understands its audience, you, with a terrifying microscopic precision that you don't even possess about yourself.
Yep.
The value it communicates is the toxic validation of your absolute worst anxieties. And the need it expresses is just your continued obsessive engagement.
And this brings us to the profound conclusion of the text. This fundamentally redefines the concept of national security. For the entire history of civilization, defending a nation meant guarding physical borders, oceans, mountains, walls.
The physical gatekeepers again.
Exactly. But the text explicitly states that the battlefield has literally shifted. The front line of modern warfare is now the individual human psyche.
That is heavy. The war isn't happening on a map. It's happening on your news feed, in your group chats, in those quiet, isolated moments when you're just scrolling on your phone before bed. You are the territory being conquered.
Which leads to the most chilling legal implication in the research. In an era of persistent automated psychological siege, our constitutional privacy protections have effectively been rendered obsolete.
Well, yeah, because our laws are deeply rooted in the physical world. The Fourth Amendment was built to stop the government from physically entering your house and reading your paper mail. It was never designed to protect against an invisible digital architecture that monitors your neural responses to micro-targeted linguistic stimuli.
Exactly. When the siege is automated, invisible, and operates strictly on the cognitive level, a traditional legal right to privacy offers absolutely zero defense against the manipulation of your own biological responses.
So let's zoom out and look at the massive journey we've taken you on today. We started by looking at the old world, the heavy oak doors and the Mount Rushmore molds, where elite TV gatekeepers controlled exactly who got to speak and what they were allowed to say.
The era of the statues.
Right. Then we saw how the democratizing power of the internet and the smartphone shattered those physical doors, making raw vulnerability and messy authenticity the new requirements for gaining an audience.
From there, we examined the mechanics of actually using that audience. We learned from Keisha Brewer that whether you were trying to land a massive corporate partnership or just find a partner in life, persuasion relies on a strategic, symbiotic framework.
Identifying your goal, deeply understanding the audience to align values, and expressing a clear need.
But then we hit the algorithmic siege. We saw how those exact same mechanics of understanding an audience and tailoring a message have been fully automated, scaled to billions of people, and weaponized by state actors to wage a silent war on our neuro-linguistic vulnerabilities.
That's a lot to process.
It is. But we want to bring the stakes of this research right to your doorstep. You, listening to this right now, are the target audience. Every single day, the posts you scroll past, the videos that autoplay, the headlines that inexplicably make your blood pressure spike, they're all forms of strategic, weaponized communication. And your personal data, your habits, your quiet fears, that is the exact ammunition being fed into this cognitive machinery. But the knowledge you've gained today, simply understanding how the casino architect is manipulating the environment, is your first and best defense mechanism.
It's all about finally seeing the invisible walls, which leaves us with a final, lingering question for you to mull over as you go about your day. We've established that the new front line of national security is the individual psyche, and that our old physical privacy laws are completely obsolete against a cognitive attack.
Right.
So moving forward, will future governments be forced to step in and install literal cognitive firewalls in our digital lives to protect us from these state actors? And if a government actually tries to regulate the types of micro-targeted stimuli our brains are allowed to process, what exactly happens to our free will?
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.